Sometimes, a simple act of kindness can change everything. When a young cashier noticed an elderly woman counting pennies at checkout, she made a decision that would transform both their lives forever. The cashier quietly paid for the woman's groceries, thinking nothing more of it. But 7 days later, 50 lawyers walked through those same supermarket doors. What happened next will restore your faith in humanity and show you that goodness always finds a way to multiply. This isn't just about groceries or lawyers. This is about the ripple effect of compassion, the power of one moment, and how the universe has its own way of balancing the scales. If you believe in the magic of human kindness, hit that like button, subscribe for more inspiring stories, and let me know in the comments about a time when a stranger's kindness changed your day. Because what you're about to hear proves that every good deed, no matter how small, creates waves that reach farther than we could ever imagine. Main story, let me tell you about Sarah Martinez, a 23-year-old cashier at Riverside Grocery, a modest supermarket in the heart of Portland, Oregon. Sarah had been working the evening shift for 2 years, scanning barcodes and counting change while putting herself through community college. She knew the rhythm of her neighborhood, the regular customers who came in after work, the families picking up dinner ingredients, the elderly folks who shopped during quieter hours when the aisles weren't crowded with rushing commuters. It was a Tuesday evening in March when Margaret Thompson shuffled through the automatic doors, her weathered hands gripping a small shopping cart. At 78 years old, Margaret moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to navigate the world with caution. Her gray hair was neatly pinned back, and she wore a faded blue cardigan that had seen many seasons. Sarah noticed her immediately, not because Margaret was unusual, but because there was something deeply familiar about her gentle presence. Margaret made her way through the store methodically, checking prices twice before placing items in her cart. A loaf of bread marked down for quick sale, a small carton of eggs, a can of soup, generic brand crackers. Each item was chosen with the careful consideration of someone living on a fixed income, someone who had learned to make every dollar stretch as far as possible. When Margaret approached Sarah's checkout lane, she began unloading her modest purchases with slow, deliberate movements. Sarah greeted her with the same warm smile she offered all her customers, but something about Margaret's quiet dignity touched her in a way she hadn't expected. As Sarah scanned each item, she could see Margaret mentally calculating the total, her lips moving slightly with each beep of the scanner. The final total came to $37.42. Margaret opened her small, worn purse and began counting out bills and change. One $10 bill, crumpled and soft from use. 2 $5 bills, 8 single-dollar bills. Then came the quarters, nickels, dimes, and pennies. Sarah watched patiently as Margaret counted each coin, her weathered fingers working through the small pile of change she had gathered from the bottom of her purse. But when Margaret reached the end of her count, she was short, $2.18 short. The color drained from her face as she recounted the money, hoping she had made a mistake. But the numbers didn't change. She looked up at Sarah with eyes that held a mixture of embarrassment and quiet desperation. "I'm sorry, dear," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I seem to be a little short. Could you please take off the crackers and the soup?" In that moment, Sarah saw something in Margaret's eyes that she recognized from her own childhood, from the times her single mother had to count every penny at the store, from the nights when dinner was whatever they could afford after paying the bills. Without hesitation, without even thinking about it, Sarah reached into her own purse and pulled out a $5 bill. "Don't worry about it," Sarah said gently, slipping the money into her register. "It's taken care of." Margaret looked at her in surprise. "Oh, honey, I couldn't let you do that." "It's already done," Sarah replied with a smile. "Have a wonderful evening, and I hope you enjoy your groceries." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She reached across the counter and gently squeezed Sarah's hand. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea what this means to me." Sarah helped Margaret bag her groceries and watched as the elderly woman made her way slowly toward the exit. As Margaret pushed through the doors and disappeared into the evening, Sarah felt a warmth in her chest that she couldn't quite explain. It was the kind of feeling that comes from doing something right, something necessary, something that connects us to our shared humanity. The next few days passed normally for Sarah. She continued her routine of work and school, thinking occasionally about Margaret, but not expecting anything more from their brief encounter. Acts of kindness, she had learned from her mother, weren't performed with the expectation of reward or recognition. They were simply the right thing to do, the way decent people moved through the world. But on the following Tuesday, exactly 1 week after their first meeting, Sarah noticed an unusual commotion in the store parking lot. Black sedans were pulling into spaces, and well-dressed people were emerging from the vehicles. She counted 10, then 20, then 30 people in expensive suits walking purposefully toward the store entrance. By the time they had all gathered, Sarah realized there were close to 50 individuals standing in her grocery store, all wearing the kind of professional attire that suggested serious business. At the front of this impressive group stood Margaret Thompson, but she looked completely different from the woman Sarah had met the previous week. Gone was the faded cardigan, replaced by an elegant navy dress suit. Her hair was professionally styled, and she carried herself with a confident bearing of someone accustomed to command. Behind her stood men and women who were clearly lawyers, their briefcases and serious expressions leaving no doubt about their profession. Sarah's manager, Robert Chun, approached the group with obvious confusion and growing concern. In his 15 years of managing the store, he had never encountered anything quite like this. 50 lawyers standing in his produce section was definitely outside the realm of normal grocery store operations. "How can I help you folks?" Robert asked, trying to maintain his professional composure despite the surreal nature of the situation. Margaret stepped forward, her voice now carrying the authority that had been hidden beneath her previous quiet demeanor. "I'm looking for one of your cashiers, Sarah Martinez. I believe she's working today." Robert's mind immediately went to worst-case scenarios. Had Sarah done something wrong? Was the store about to face some kind of lawsuit? He had always known Sarah to be honest, hardworking, and kind to customers, but the presence of so many legal professionals suggested something serious was happening. "May I ask what this is regarding?" Robert inquired, his voice careful and measured. Margaret smiled, and for a moment Sarah could see the gentlewoman from the previous week. "I have some business to discuss with Miss Martinez. Nothing that should concern you or your store. In fact, I think you'll find it's quite the opposite." BT's time word had spread throughout the store. Employees were gathering at the ends of aisles. Customers were stopping their shopping to stare, and Sarah, who had been restocking bags at her register, was walking over to see what was causing such a commotion. As she approached, she recognized Margaret immediately, though she was confused by the dramatic change in her appearance and the small army of lawyers surrounding her. "Margaret," Sarah said, her voice tentative and uncertain. Margaret turned toward Sarah, and her entire demeanor soft. The commanding presence that had addressed Robert melted away, replaced by the warmth and gratitude that Sarah remembered from their first meeting. "Hello, dear," Marguerite said, walking over to Sarah and taking her hands in her own. "I told you that you had no idea what your kindness meant to me. I've come back to show you." Sarah looked around at the assembled lawyers, then back at Margaret. "I don't understand. What's happening? Are you in some kind of trouble?" Margaret laughed, a sound that was both gentle and filled with joy. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm not in trouble, but I do have quite a story to tell you, and I think everyone here deserves to hear it." Margaret turned to address the growing crowd of store employees and curious customers who had gathered around them. Her voice carried clearly through the store, and even the lawyers behind her seemed to lean in to hear the story they had all come to witness. "My name is Margaret Thompson," she began, "and last week I came into this store as I have many times before, but last Tuesday was different. I was having what I thought might be one of the worst days of my life. You see, I had just received news that would change everything for me, but on that Tuesday evening I didn't yet understand what it meant." She paused, looking directly at Sarah before continuing. 3 weeks ago, I received a certified letter from a law firm in New York City. The letter informed me that a distant relative I had never met, my great-aunt Eleanor, had passed away and left me her entire estate. The lawyers who sent the letter explained that Eleanor had spent years searching for family members and had finally located me through a genealogy service. The crowd around them was completely silent, hanging on every word of Margaret's story. Sarah felt her heart racing as she began to understand that something extraordinary was happening. The inheritance was substantial, Margaret continued. More money than I had ever dreamed of having. But there was a condition in Eleanor's will that I found both puzzling and beautiful. She stipulated that before I could claim the inheritance, I had to spend 1 full week living exactly as I had been living, making no changes to my routine, my spending habits, or my lifestyle. Eleanor wanted to ensure that her money would go to someone who understood the value of every dollar, someone who had learned to live with dignity even when resources were scarce. Margaret looked around at the faces surrounding her, seeing understanding begin to dawn in their expressions. So last Tuesday, I came here for my weekly grocery shopping. Just as I always did. I counted my limited money carefully. Just as I always did. And when I found myself short at the register, I felt the familiar embarrassment and worry that I had experienced so many times before. She turned back to Sarah, her eyes bright with emotion. But then this remarkable young woman did something that changed everything. Without hesitation, without making me feel small or ashamed, she quietly paid for my groceries with her own money. She saw another human being in need, and she responded with immediate, unselfish kindness. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as she began to understand the magnitude of what had happened. But Margaret, I just did what anyone would do. It was only a few dollars. Only a few dollars, Margaret repeated, shaking her head. Sarah, do you know what those few dollars represented? They represented compassion in action. They represented the kind of person Eleanor hoped would benefit from her generosity. They represented exactly the kind of heart that deserves to be supported and celebrated. Margaret gestured to the lawyers behind her. These wonderful professionals have spent the last week helping me understand my inheritance and plan what to do with Eleanor's gift. The estate is worth $12 million, Sarah. $12 million that now belongs to me because of Eleanor's generosity, but that I want to share because of your generosity. The store erupted in gasps and murmurs. Sarah felt her knees go weak, and Robert had to steady her with his hand on her shoulder. The number was so large, so beyond anything in her experience, that she couldn't fully process what Margaret was saying. Now, Margaret continued, raising her hand for quiet, I want to be very clear about something. I'm not giving this money away because I feel obligated to, or because I think it will buy me anything. I'm sharing it because I believe that kindness should be multiplied, that generosity should create more generosity, and that good people should be supported in their efforts to make the world better. One of the lawyers stepped forward, a distinguished woman in her 50s with graying hair and kind eyes. My name is Patricia Williams, she said, and I'm the executor of Eleanor Thompson's estate. What, Senora, Margaret Thompson is about to offer is completely legal, completely voluntary, and completely in keeping with the spirit of Eleanor's original bequest. Patricia opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder of documents. Sara Martinez Margaret would like to establish an educational trust fund in your name, worth $500,000 to ensure that you can complete your education without financial worry. Additionally, she would like to provide you with a direct gift of $250,000 to use however you see fit, whether that's helping your family, starting your own business, or simply having the security that comes with knowing you won't have to count pennies at the grocery store. Sarah stared at the lawyer, then at Margaret, then back at the lawyer. The numbers were so far beyond her reality that they seemed fictional. $750,000. More money than her family had ever dreamed of having. More money than she had thought existed in the world, at least for people like her. I don't understand, Sarah whispered. This can't be real. Margaret stepped closer and took Sarah's hands again. It's completely real, sweetheart. But there's more. You see, your act of kindness didn't just help me buy groceries. It showed me what Eleanor was looking for in her heir. It showed me the kind of heart that deserves support. And it gave me the most beautiful idea for how to honor both Eleanor's memory and your generosity. Margaret turned to address the wider crowd again. I'm also establishing the Eleanor Thompson Foundation for Everyday Kindness with an initial endowment of $2 million. This foundation will identify and support individuals who, like Sarah, demonstrate extraordinary kindness in ordinary circumstances. We'll be looking for people who help others without expecting recognition, who share what little they have with those who have even less, who make the world brighter simply by being in it. The entire store had gone completely silent, except for the occasional sniffle as people wiped away tears. Robert found himself crying openly, thinking about all the times he had watched Sarah stay late to help elderly customers find items on high shelves, or the way she always treated everyone with the same respect and kindness, regardless of how much they were spending. "But that's still not all," Margaret continued, clearly enjoying the impact her words were having. "I've also spoken with the owner of this grocery store, Mr. James Peterson, and we've arranged to establish a fund that will help customers who find themselves short at the register. No one should have to choose between groceries and dignity. We're calling it the Sarah Martinez Customer Assistance Fund, and it will be available to help anyone who needs it." Sarah was crying now, overwhelmed by the cascade of generosity that had resulted from her simple act of kindness. "Margaret, this is too much. I can't accept all of this. I just did what felt right." "And that," Margaret said firmly, "is exactly why you deserve it." Eleanor's will specified that her inheritance should go to someone who understood the value of money, but wasn't defined by it. Someone who had learned to live with grace under pressure. Someone who would use unexpected fortune to create more good in the world. "Sarah, you demonstrated all of those qualities in the space of 30 seconds at a grocery store checkout." "Petrusa?" The lawyer stepped forward again. "Sarah, I want you to understand that accepting this gift creates no obligations for you beyond being yourself. There are no strings attached, no requirements for how you must spend or invest the money. Margaret simply wants to ensure that your kindness is rewarded, and that you have the freedom to pursue whatever dreams you might have." Another lawyer, a tall man with silver hair, joined the conversation. "My name is David Chun, and I specialize in educational trusts. The fund we're establishing for your education will cover not just tuition, but also living expenses, books, and any other costs associated with your studies. Whether you want to finish your associate degree, transfer to a 4-year university, or pursue graduate studies, this trust will support you completely." Sarah looked around at all the faces surrounding her. Store employees, customers, lawyers, all of them smiling and nodding encouragingly. She felt as if she were in a dream, as if reality had somehow shifted into something magical and impossible. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up," Sarah said, laughing through her tears. "This doesn't happen to people like me." "What do you mean, people like you?" Margaret asked gently. "You know," Sarah gestured around the store, "working-class people. People who count change and shop with coupons and wear the same uniform every day. People who pay for community college one semester at a time because that's all they can afford." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "Sarah, let me tell you something I've learned in my 78 years on this earth. Kindness isn't distributed according to social class or income level. Some of the most generous people I've known have been those who had the least to give, and some of the most selfish people I've encountered have been those who had more than they could ever need." She paused, looking around at the assembled crowd. Eleanor understood this. She grew up poor, worked her way through school, built a successful business, and spent her later years looking for someone who embodied the values that had guided her through life. Not someone who was born wealthy, not someone who was given opportunities, but someone who created kindness out of their own character. Margaret pulled an envelope from her purse and handed it to Sarah. "This is a letter from Eleanor that I want you to have. She wrote it hoping that someday she would find the right person to give it to. I think she would be very happy to know that it's going to you." Sarah opened the envelope with trembling hands and unfolded a handwritten letter on cream-colored stationery. The handwriting was elegant but shaky, clearly written by someone in their later years. "Would you like me to read it aloud?" Sarah asked, looking at Margaret. "I think Eleanor would have liked that," Margaret replied. Sarah cleared her throat and began to read. "To the person who receives this letter, if you are reading these words, it means that someone recognized in you the same qualities that guided me throughout my life. You have demonstrated kindness without expectation of reward, generosity when you had little to give, and dignity in the face of financial challenge." Sarah paused, her voice catching with emotion. The words seemed written specifically for her, as if Eleanor had somehow seen their encounter at the checkout and written the letter in response. She continued reading. "I grew up during the Great Depression, when families helped families, because that was the only way any of us survived. I learned that true wealth isn't measured in bank accounts, but in the willingness to share whatever you have with others. I built my business on the principle that success means creating opportunities for others, not just accumulating resources for yourself." The crowd around them was completely silent, captivated by Eleanor's words reaching across time to speak directly to their current situation. "I never married, never had children of my own, but I always hoped that my life's work would eventually benefit someone who understood that money is simply a tool for creating more kindness in the world. I hope that whatever inheritance you receive will amplify your natural generosity and give you the freedom to help others in ways both large and small." Sarah looked up from the letter, tears streaming down her face. "There's more," she said, returning to Eleanor's words. "Remember that every act of kindness creates ripples that extend far beyond what we can see. The few dollars you share with a stranger might change their day, their week, or their entire life. The patience you show to someone who is struggling might restore their faith in human goodness. The respect you offer to those whom society overlooks might be the only dignity they experience that day." The letter concluded with words that seemed to summarize everything that had happened over the past week. "Use this gift to multiply kindness, support dreams, and remind the world that generosity is the most renewable resource we possess. Thank you for being exactly the person I hoped to find. With admiration and gratitude, Eleanor Thompson." When Sarah finished reading, there wasn't a dry eye in the store. Even the lawyers, who had presumably heard this story before, were visibly moved by hearing Eleanor's words read aloud in the place where Sarah's kindness had first been witnessed. Margaret broke the silence. "Eleanor wrote that letter 20 years ago, Sarah. She updated it several times over the years, but the core message never changed. She was looking for someone exactly like you. Someone who would understand that true wealth means having enough to share with others." Patricia the lawyer stepped forward with her folder of documents. "Sarah, we've prepared all the necessary paperwork to establish both the educational trust and the direct gift. You don't need to make any decisions today about how to use the money, but we do need your signature on a few forms to begin the process." Sarah looked at the documents, still struggling to believe that any of this was real. "What do I need to do?" "Just be yourself," Margaret said simply. "Continue being the person who saw someone in need and responded with immediate kindness. Continue treating every person you encounter with respect and dignity. Continue believing that small acts of goodness matter." David Chun, the educational trust lawyer, spread several documents on a nearby checkout counter. "These forms will establish your educational trust fund. The money will be available to you immediately for tuition, books, and living expenses. You can use it for any accredited educational program, from community college through graduate school." As Sarah signed the documents, her hand shaking slightly with nervousness and excitement, other lawyers were setting up additional paperwork. The direct gift required separate documentation, and the establishment of the Eleanor Thompson Foundation needed Sarah's input, since she would serve on the advisory board to help identify other recipients of support. "Sarah," Margaret said as the paperwork was being completed, "I want you to understand something important. This money doesn't change who you are. It doesn't make you better than anyone else, and it doesn't create any obligation for you to be perfect or to live up to anyone else's expectations. You are receiving this gift because you already are exactly the person Eleanor hoped to find." Robert, Sarah's manager, had been standing quietly to the side, watching the proceedings with amazement. "Sarah," he said, "I want you to know that you can take as much time off as you need to process all of this and make whatever plans you want to make for your future. Your job will be here whenever you want it, but I suspect you're going to have a lot of new opportunities to consider." Sarah looked at Robert, then at Margaret, then at all the faces surrounding her. These people, most of whom had been complete strangers an hour ago, had become witnesses to a moment that would change her life forever. But more than that, they had become part of a story that proved kindness could multiply in ways that seemed almost magical. "I do want to keep working here," Sarah said, surprising everyone, including herself. "At least for now. This place, these people, this is where I learned that a few dollars and a kind word could mean everything to someone. I want to stay connected to that lesson." Margaret beamed at her response. Eleanor would have loved that answer. She never stopped working, never lost touch with the values that had shaped her. She believed that our connection to everyday kindness keeps us grounded in what really matters. Over the next hour, as the lawyers completed their paperwork and began packing up their briefcases, Customers and employees continued to approach Sarah with congratulations, hugs, and their own stories of times when small kindnesses had made big differences in their lives. The grocery store had become an impromptu gathering place for people to celebrate the idea that goodness could be rewarded in extraordinary ways. As the lawyers prepared to leave, Patricia handed Sarah a business card and a thick folder containing copies of all the documents they had signed. "Everything is official now," she said. "The money will be available in your accounts within 48 hours. Please don't hesitate to call if you have any questions about managing your new resources." Margaret was the last to leave. She hugged Sarah tightly, and for a moment they were just two women who had found something precious in each other's kindness. "Thank you," Margaret whispered. "Thank you for showing me that Eleanor's faith in human goodness was justified. Thank you for proving that kindness still exists in the world." "Thank you," Sarah replied, "for showing me that doing the right thing really does matter, even when nobody's watching." As Margaret walked toward the exit, she turned back one final time. "Sarah, I'll be in touch soon about the foundation. We have a lot of work to do, finding other people who deserve recognition for their everyday kindness. I can't think of anyone I'd rather have as a partner in that work." After everyone had left, Sarah stood in the now quiet store, still wearing her grocery store uniform, still surrounded by the familiar sights and sounds of her workplace, but knowing that everything had changed. She thought about her mother, who had taught her that kindness was its own reward, never imagining that sometimes that reward could be measured in ways that seemed impossible. She thought about Eleanor, a woman she had never met, but who had somehow seen across the years to recognize exactly the moment when Sarah's character would be revealed. She thought about Margaret, who had chosen to multiply her good fortune rather than simply enjoying it privately. But mostly, she thought about the simple truth that had been proven that day, that every act of kindness, no matter how small, has the potential to create something beautiful and unexpected. That treating others with dignity and generosity isn't just the right thing to do. It's the thing that connects us to possibilities we never could have imagined. The next morning, Sarah woke up wondering if the entire experience had been an elaborate dream. But when she checked her phone, she found a text message from Patricia the lawyer, confirming that the funds had been transferred and that her new reality was indeed real. She also found a voice message from Margaret. "Good morning, dear. I hope you slept well. I wanted you to know that I've already received calls from 3 local news stations who want to interview us about what happened yesterday. I've told them that any interviews will only happen if you're comfortable with them, and only if we can use the attention to promote the foundation and encourage more everyday kindness. Think about it and let me know what you'd like to do." Sarah smiled as she listened to the message, realizing that Margaret was still thinking about how to multiply the impact of their story. The money was wonderful, life-changing, and deeply appreciated. But the real gift was being part of something that celebrated the kind of human connection that made the world better. When Sarah arrived at work that afternoon, she found that word of the previous day's events had spread throughout the community. Customers were stopping by not just to shop, but to congratulate her, and to share their own stories of kindness, given and received. The store had become a place where people came to be reminded that goodness was possible, that generosity was contagious, and that ordinary people could create extraordinary moments. And at the checkout counter, where it all began, Sarah continued doing what she had always done, treating every customer with respect, responding to need with kindness, and proving every day that Eleanor's faith in human nature had been absolutely justified. The Eleanor Thompson Foundation would go on to support hundreds of individuals whose quiet acts of kindness might otherwise have gone unnoticed. The Sarah Martinez Customer Assistance Fund would help countless people maintain their dignity while getting the groceries they needed. And Sarah herself would complete her education, eventually opening a nonprofit organization dedicated to connecting generous individuals with opportunities to help their communities. But all of that growth and expansion grew from one simple moment: a young woman seeing someone in need and responding with immediate, unselfish kindness. It grew from the understanding that we all have the power to change someone's day, someone's week, or someone's entire life, simply by choosing compassion over indifference. Margaret and Sarah remained close friends for many years, working together on the foundation and regularly reminding each other that the most powerful force for good in the world isn't money or influence or fame. It's the decision that ordinary people make every day to treat each other with kindness, dignity, and generosity. And every Tuesday evening, on the anniversary of their first meeting, Margaret would visit the store to buy groceries. Not because she needed to, but because she wanted to remember the place where kindness had multiplied into something beautiful, where two women had discovered that goodness really does find a way to create more goodness, and where the simple act of caring about a stranger had proven that love is indeed the most renewable resource we possess. Years passed, and the ripple effects of that Tuesday evening continued to expand in ways that neither Sarah nor Margaret could have anticipated. The Eleanor Thompson Foundation had grown from Margaret's initial endowment into a nationally recognized organization with chapters in 43 states. What started as a simple idea to recognize everyday kindness had evolved into a movement that was changing how communities thought about supporting one another. Sarah had completed her associate degree and transferred to Portland State University, where she majored in nonprofit management with a minor in social work. The educational trust fund that Margaret had established not only covered all her expenses, but also allowed her to focus entirely on her studies and volunteer work with the foundation. She graduated summa cum laude and was accepted into graduate programs at several prestigious universities. But she chose to stay in Portland to continue the work that had become her passion. The foundation's impact had been documented in academic studies, featured in national magazines, and even inspired a documentary film that premiered at the Sundance Film Festival. But for Sarah and Margaret, the most meaningful measure of their success remained the individual stories of people whose lives had been touched by unexpected kindness. There was Maria Santos, a single mother working 2 jobs, who had been recognized by the foundation after a co-worker nominated her, regularly bringing extra lunches to share with colleagues who couldn't afford to buy food during their shifts. The foundation's support allowed Maria to reduce her hours and enroll in nursing school, and she now works as a registered nurse at the same hospital where she once cleaned floors. There was James Wright, a 70-year-old retired teacher who had been spending his own Social Security money to buy school supplies for students in his former district. The foundation not only reimbursed his expenses, but also established a permanent fund to ensure that no child in his district would lack basic supplies. James became a foundation ambassador, traveling to schools across the country to talk about the importance of supporting education. There was Alina Rodriguez, a teenager who had been using her part-time job earnings to pay for groceries for elderly neighbors in her apartment complex. The foundation provided her with a full college scholarship and helped her establish a neighborhood support network that became a model for similar programs in urban areas nationwide. Each story reinforced Margaret and Sarah's belief that kindness was everywhere, waiting to be noticed and celebrated. They had learned that recognition and support didn't just help individual recipients. It also inspired others to look for opportunities to be generous in their own lives. The Sarah Martinez Customer Assistance Fund had also grown far beyond its original scope. What started as a way to help customers who were short at the checkout had evolved into a comprehensive program that addressed food insecurity in the Portland area. Local businesses had contributed additional funding, volunteers had organized food drives, and social workers had been hired to connect struggling families with other resources and services. Robert Chun, Sarah's former manager, had been promoted to district manager and had worked to implement similar programs in grocery stores throughout the Pacific Northwest. He often told people that watching Sarah's story unfold had changed his understanding of what it meant to create value in business, teaching him that companies could measure success not just in profits, but in the positive impact they had on their communities. The original Riverside Grocery had become something of a pilgrimage site for people who had heard Sarah and Margaret's story. Visitors would come from across the country to see the checkout lane where it all began, often bringing their own stories of kindness given and received. The store manager had installed a small plaque near Register 3 that read, "In recognition of the truth that every act of kindness creates possibilities we cannot imagine." But perhaps the most significant development had been Margaret's decision to move from her longtime home in the hills above Portland to a modest apartment, just 6 blocks from the grocery store. At 81, she wanted to be closer to the foundation's work and to the community that had embraced their mission so enthusiastically. "I spent too many years isolated from the very people whose lives I wanted to impact," Margaret had explained to Sarah when she announced her decision to move. Eleanor's letter reminded me that staying connected to everyday kindness requires being part of an everyday community. Margaret's new apartment became an informal headquarters for the Foundation's local activities. Her living room hosted planning meetings. Her kitchen table was where they reviewed applications from people nominated for support, and her front porch became a gathering place where neighbors would stop to chat about their own experiences with giving and receiving help. The relationship between Sarah and Margaret had evolved from grateful strangers to surrogate, grandmother and granddaughter. They spoke nearly every day, worked together on Foundation business, and had developed the kind of easy companionship that comes from shared purpose and mutual respect. "You know," Margaret had said to Sarah on a recent evening as they sat on her porch reviewing grant applications, "Eleanor would have been amazed to see what grew from her simple bequest. She thought she was just providing for one person who demonstrated the values she cared about. She never could have imagined that it would become a catalyst for this much goodness." Sarah looked up from the application she was reading. The story of a man who had been driving elderly neighbors to medical appointments using his own gas money. "I think about that a lot," she said. "How one person's vision of what was possible became the foundation for so many other people to discover what was possible in their own lives." They had received over 10,000 nominations in the past 3 years from people in all 50 states and several foreign countries. Teachers nominated students who shared their lunch money with classmates. Nurses nominated colleagues who stayed late to comfort patients' families. Grocery store employees nominated customers who helped elderly shoppers reach items on high shelves. Children nominated adults who had shown them unexpected kindness. And adults nominated children whose generosity had restored their faith in the future. The selection process had become increasingly sophisticated, with regional committees, site visits, and comprehensive background checks to ensure that recipients truly embodied the values Eleanor had outlined in her letter. But Margaret and Sarah insisted on personally reviewing every nomination, reading every story, and making the final decisions about who would receive support. "The numbers matter," Sarah would tell new volunteers, "but the stories are what keep us connected to why this work is important. Every application represents someone who saw a need and responded with their heart instead of their wallet." The Foundation had also established partnerships with major universities to study the sociology and psychology of everyday kindness. Researchers were documenting how recognition and support for small acts of generosity influenced community behavior, measuring changes in volunteering rates, charitable giving, and general social cohesion in areas where the Foundation was active. Dr. Angela Martinez, a sociology professor at the University of Oregon who had been studying the Foundation's impact for 2 years, had preliminary findings that surprised even veteran social scientists. "What we're seeing," she explained during a presentation to the Foundation's board, "is that celebrating small acts of kindness creates what we might call a generosity feedback loop. When people see that kindness is noticed and valued, they become more likely to act kindly themselves, which creates more opportunities for recognition, which creates more modeling of generous behavior." The data showed measurable increases in volunteer participation, neighborhood assistance programs, and informal helping behaviors in communities where the Foundation was active. More significantly, these changes seemed to persist over time, suggesting that the Foundation's work was creating lasting cultural shifts rather than temporary behavioral changes. Margaret found these research findings fascinating, but she was more interested in the individual transformations she witnessed every day. She had seen how receiving recognition for kindness changed people's understanding of their own capacity to make a difference. She had watched shy, self-deprecating individuals discover that their quiet generosity was both noticed and valued by others. "The money helps," Margaret would often say, "but the recognition changes how people see themselves and their place in the world. When someone learns that their small acts of kindness matter to others, they start to believe that they have something valuable to contribute." This understanding had led the Foundation to expand its mission beyond financial support. They now offered leadership training for recipients, connecting them with opportunities to volunteer with other nonprofit organizations, and providing platforms for them to share their stories with wider audiences. Sarah had become a sought-after speaker at conferences, universities, and community organizations. Her presentations focused not on her own story, but on the hundreds of people whose kindness had been recognized by the Foundation. She would tell audiences about the high school student who organized coat drives for homeless shelters, the retired plumber who fixed appliances for free for low-income families, and the restaurant owner who prepared free meals every Thanksgiving for anyone who needed them. The point isn't that these people are unusually good, Sarah would explain to her audiences. The point is that this kind of goodness is everywhere, all around us, every single day. We just need to notice it, celebrate it, and create systems that support it. One of Sarah's most popular presentations was called the grocery store test, based on the idea that how we treat strangers in everyday situations reveals our true character. She would ask audiences to think about their own experiences in checkout lines, at bus stops, in parking lots, and other mundane locations where we encounter people who need small acts of assistance. The test isn't whether you help, Sarah would explain. The test is whether you notice the opportunity to help. The test is whether your default response to someone else's struggle is compassion or indifference. The test is whether you believe that your small actions matter enough to take them. These presentations had led to speaking invitations at corporate conferences, where business leaders wanted to understand how to create more compassionate workplace cultures. Sarah would work with companies to develop recognition programs for employees who demonstrated exceptional kindness to colleagues, customers, or community members. She had been particularly successful working with retail chains, restaurants, and other service industries where employees regularly interacted with the public. Her programs helped companies understand that supporting employee kindness wasn't just good for morale. It was also good for customer satisfaction, employee retention, and community reputation. Margaret often accompanied Sarah to these corporate presentations, sharing her perspective as someone who had experienced both poverty and wealth, both isolation and community connection. Her presence added gravitas to Sarah's message and helped business audiences understand that investing in kindness was not just idealistic, but pragmatic. When your employees feel supported in being generous, Margaret would tell corporate leaders, they create the kind of customer experience that builds loyalty and trust. When your company is known for supporting community kindness, you attract both customers and employees who share those values. The foundation had also begun working with schools to develop curriculum around recognizing and practicing everyday kindness. Elementary students learned to notice when classmates needed help with assignments, playground equipment, or social inclusion. Middle school students organized peer mentoring programs and community service projects. High school students developed leadership skills by coordinating kindness recognition programs in their own schools. The educational initiatives had been particularly successful in schools with high rates of poverty, where students often felt that they had nothing valuable to contribute to their communities. The Foundation's approach helped young people understand that kindness was a resource they possessed regardless of their family's economic situation. We've learned that children who grow up recognizing and practicing small acts of kindness develop stronger empathy, better conflict resolution skills, and more resilience in facing their own challenges, explained Dr. Patricia Williams, who had left her law practice to become the Foundation's Director of Educational Programs. The Foundation's work with youth had also led to the establishment of summer internship programs, where high school and college students worked directly with local nonprofits while learning about social entrepreneurship, grant writing, and community organizing. Many of these interns went on to careers in nonprofit work, social work, or public service. Margaret took particular pride in these educational programs, often saying that teaching young people to notice and value kindness was the most important investment the Foundation could make. If we can help children understand that their capacity for goodness is their greatest asset, she would say, we're preparing them to create the kind of world Eleanor dreamed about. As the Foundation's 5th anniversary approached, Margaret and Sarah began planning a celebration that would bring together recipients, volunteers, donors, and community partners from across the country. They wanted to create an event that would showcase the breadth and depth of the movement that had grown from their chance encounter at a grocery store checkout. The planning process revealed just how far their influence had spread. They received RSVPs from Foundation recipients in 43 states, volunteer coordinators from dozens of cities, researchers from universities studying their programs, and business leaders who had implemented kindness recognition programs in their companies. The celebration was held at the Portland Convention Center, with breakout sessions on topics ranging from measuring the impact of everyday kindness to creating sustainable support systems for community generosity. But the centerpiece of the event was a series of storytelling sessions where foundation recipients shared their experiences and the ways that recognition had changed their approach to helping others. Maria Santos, the former hospital custodian who had become a registered nurse, spoke about how receiving foundation support had shown her that her instinct to care for others was not just a personal trait, but a valuable professional asset. James Wright, the retired teacher, described how the Foundation's recognition had given him the confidence to advocate for educational funding at the state level. Elena Rodriguez, now a college senior, majoring in social work, talked about how early recognition for her kindness had shaped her career goals and her understanding of her own potential. But perhaps the most moving presentation came from an unexpected source: Robert Chun, Sarah's former manager, who had been quietly nominated by his employees for the way he supported their efforts to help customers and community members. "I thought I was just managing a grocery store," Robert told the assembled crowd, "but watching Sarah's story unfold taught me that every workplace is an opportunity to either support or discourage human kindness. Every manager is in a position to either recognize or ignore the generous impulses of their employees." Robert had used his recognition and the small grant that came with it to establish kindness recognition programs in all the stores in his district. Employees could nominate colleagues for monthly awards. Customers could nominate employees who had been particularly helpful, and stores competed to see which location could document the most acts of kindness each quarter. "What we discovered," Robert explained, "is that when you start looking for kindness, you find it everywhere. When you start recognizing it, you get more of it. When you start supporting it, it becomes part of your organizational culture." The convention's final session was a panel discussion featuring Margaret, Sarah, and 3 researchers who had been studying the Foundation's work. The conversation focused on what they had learned about human nature, community building, and the scalability of kindness-based interventions. Dr. Angela Martinez presented data showing that communities with active foundation programs had measurably higher levels of social trust, civic engagement, and collective efficacy. Dr. Patricia Williams shared evidence that children who participated in foundation educational programs scored higher on measures of empathy, prosocial behavior, and academic engagement. But the most significant finding came from Dr. Michael Chun, a behavioral economist who had been tracking the long-term outcomes for foundation recipients. His research showed that people who received recognition for kindness were significantly more likely to continue engaging in helpful behaviors, to volunteer with other organizations, and to report higher levels of life satisfaction and sense of purpose. "What we're seeing," Dr. Chun explained, "is that recognition for kindness creates what economists call a positive externality. The benefits extend far beyond the immediate recipient to include their families, their communities, and even strangers who benefit from their continued generosity." During the panel's question and answer session, an audience member asked Margaret what she thought Eleanor would make of the Foundation's growth and impact. Margaret considered the question carefully before responding. "I think Eleanor would be amazed by the scale of what has developed, but not surprised by the basic human response we've documented. She believed that kindness was the most natural and renewable resource humans possess. She believed that most people want to be good, want to help others, want to contribute to something positive." Margaret paused, looking out at the audience of several hundred people who had traveled to Portland to celebrate kindness. What Eleanor might not have anticipated is how hungry people are for recognition of their goodness. In a world that often seems to celebrate wealth, fame, or achievement, people are deeply grateful to be noticed for their compassion. Sarah added her own reflection on Eleanor's legacy. "I think what Eleanor understood, and what we've learned through this work, is that kindness isn't rare. What's rare is taking the time to notice it, celebrate it, and create systems that support it." Eleanor's gift wasn't just money. It was attention to the goodness that already existed. The convention concluded with Margaret's announcement of the Foundation's newest initiative, an international expansion that would establish kindness recognition programs in partnership with organizations in 12 countries. The Eleanor Thompson Foundation for Everyday Kindness was going global, carrying the message that compassion is a universal language and that small acts of goodness, deserve recognition regardless of cultural context. As attendees prepared to return to their home communities, many carrying new ideas and renewed enthusiasm for recognizing kindness in their own neighborhoods, Margaret and Sarah stood together in the convention center, reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Sometimes I still can't believe this all started with groceries and $2.18, Sarah said, shaking her head in amazement. Margaret smiled, remembering the shy young woman who had quietly paid for a stranger's purchases 5 years earlier. Eleanor always said that the most important moments in our lives often look completely ordinary while they're happening. It's only later that we understand their significance. As they walked through the empty convention center, past displays documenting hundreds of stories of everyday kindness, past photographs of people whose lives had been changed by recognition and support, past research data showing measurable improvements in community well-being, Margaret and Sarah could see the ongoing impact of that Tuesday evening when kindness had multiplied into something neither of them could have imagined. The ripple effects continued to expand, touching lives in ways both large and small, proving every day that Eleanor's faith in human goodness had been completely justified, and that Sarah's simple act of compassion had indeed created possibilities that neither of them could ever have imagined. And somewhere in the growing archive of Foundation stories, Eleanor's letter continued to speak across time to each new recipient. Remember that every act of kindness creates ripples that extend far beyond what we can see. The truth of those words had been proven thousands of times over. In grocery stores, in classrooms, in hospitals and offices, in neighborhoods and communities across the country, where people had learned that their capacity for goodness was their greatest gift to the world.